In August of 1600, 500 warriors made a stand that changed the fate of Japan. Their battlefield was a stone fortress called Fushimi Castle, guarding the southern approaches to Kyoto. Their leader was Torii Mototada, an aging samurai, loyal unto death. Their enemy was the Western Army, a coalition led by Ishida Mitsunari, and their goal was nothing less than domination of the realm. Torii knew he would die. That was never in question. What mattered was time, how many days his men could delay the tide while Tokugawa Ieyasu, commander of the Eastern Army, marched from Edo in the east to strike a final blow at Sekigahara. Now, as the summer sun scorched the valleys and cicadas screamed in the reeds, all paths converged on Fushimi. Built atop a rise near the fork of the Yodo and Uji rivers, Fushimi Castle overlooked the water arteries flowing into Kyoto. The city was the jewel of central Japan, the seat of imperial prestige. If Mitsunari reached it first, he could claim legitimacy in the emperor's name. If Ieyasu beat him there, he would have the leverage to rule unchallenged. So Fushimi became the gate, and Torii the gatekeeper. After Toyotomi Hideyoshi's death in 1598, Japan's peace unraveled. Old alliances frayed. Mitsunari, loyal to the Toyotomi heir, rallied daimyo from the west. Tokugawa Ieyasu, the strongest of Hideyoshi's former vassals, moved to secure the eastern provinces. Diplomacy gave way to mobilization. In June, Ieyasu marched east with over 30,000 men. He left behind Torii with a garrison of roughly 500 corps retainers, though historical estimates vary, some including non-combatants and allied fighters. Their orders: hold Fushimi for as long as humanly possible. The castle's stone walls stretched thick across the hill. Inside stood the inner bailey, or keep, its white-tiled roof gleaming under the brutal sun. Multiple outer baileys ringed the hill, each layered with walls, moats, and gates. Narrow corridors forced attackers into kill zones. Sally ports, small side gates, allowed defenders to strike unexpectedly. The garrison had teppo, matchlock guns, powder, yari, spears, and bowmen. But their numbers were few. Supply lines were already under threat. Summer heat spoiled rice and made water critical. Still, couriers ran messages between castles. Smoke signals curled over the ridgelines south of Kyoto. Every hour Fushimi held would buy time for Tokugawa's main army to reposition, and for key allies to declare for the eastern cause. Inside the walls, Torii Mototada summoned his officers. His voice was quiet, but every word carried weight. Ieyasu-sama entrusted this place to us, he said, looking each man in the eye. Let no one say we were unworthy. The men bowed. There was no bravado, only resolve. Southward, from Sawayama and beyond, the Western Army began to move. Ishida Mitsunari had gathered thousands, men from Chosukabe, Shimazu, and Yukita clans. Campfires dotted the hills. Sappers and laborers felled trees and dragged timbers for siege works. Engineers scouted the castle from the riverbanks, measuring angles and wind direction. By early August, the castle was encircled. An envoy came under white flag. He offered terms. Torii refused. I serve not my life, Torii said, but my lord's purpose. That night, lanterns glowed red across the western camps. The cicadas had gone quiet. In their place came the sound of hammers on wood and the distant clatter of wheels, mantlets, gabions, and siege ladders being readied. The defenders slept lightly. The storm had begun. The letter was written in firm, deliberate strokes. Torii Mototada, castellan of Fushimi, did not allow his hand to tremble. To my beloved son, he began, you must live on, even if I perish. The Tokugawa cause must not fall. He signed it with his seal and called for a courier. Outside, the wind blew hot over the hills. Leaves hung limp from the trees. The air was heavy with waiting. He had already sent his heir away. His grandsons, too. All had been escorted north under cover of darkness. Only the loyal remained. Samurai, Ashigaru, temple scouts, men who had fought under him for decades or only months. Roughly 500 stood ready. Some say more, some say less. But only this corps would face the siege. Torii knew the odds. He had fought in dozens of campaigns, served Tokugawa Ieyasu through fire and flood. This would be his last field. The keep's watchtowers gave a clear view down to the rivers. From there, roads led to Kyoto, to Uji, to Nara, arteries of trade and power. If the Western army crossed them unopposed, they would reach the capital in days. The emperor could be used, twisted, paraded as a symbol of false legitimacy. Torii would not allow that. He ordered the gates sealed and the inner wells checked. Blacksmiths worked day and night to sharpen spears and mend armor. Powder barrels were stacked in deep stores. Roof tiles were reinforced. Civilians, servants, cooks, artisans, were quietly escorted out. Only one shrine remained open within the walls. It stood near the rear gate, its paper amulets fluttering in the dusty air. Each night, torches lit the bailey in amber glow. Officers made rounds with quiet words and nods. The walls echoed with hammer strikes and murmured prayers. In the war room, Torii called a final council. Rain patted the windows. "We do not defend a castle," he said. "We defend a chance." No one argued. They had seen the gathering banners beyond the hills. From the west came men of Chosukabe, fresh from Shikoku. From the south, Shimazu warriors hardened by Kyushu's brutal campaigns. The Western army numbered in the tens of thousands. Mitsunari's coalition was bold, angry, and ready to strike. On the third morning, a signal torch flashed from a peak east of the castle. Ieyasu had crossed the Kiso River. His march toward the Takedo route had begun. That night, a senior retainer named Inaba turned to Torii on the wall. "My lord," he said quietly, "do we truly have enough to delay them?" Torii looked out across the ridges. Lanterns bobbed in the black beyond. "We have enough to make them bleed time." He touched the hilt of his sword, worn smooth from years of use. Even a flood slows when met by stone. Below, the water in the moat shimmered with torchlight. A frog leapt from a rock, vanishing into reeds. Somewhere in the dark, a flute played, soft, off-key, tired. It would be the last quiet night. The roads quaked under the weight of marching men. By the first week of August 1600, the Western Army, led by Ishida Mitsunari, encamped along the Yodo and Uji rivers. Commanders from across western Japan arrived beneath rows of fluttering war banners. Yukita Hideai, young and headstrong, commanded thousands. The grim and cautious Shima Sakan oversaw advanced scouts. Shimazu Yoshihiro, a veteran of countless wars, held back, quiet but watching. Their goal was clear: break Fushimi Castle, seize Kyoto, and strip Tokugawa Ieyasu of his claim. From their high ground, the defenders watched new enemy fires bloom each night like spreading embers. The Western Army's sappers began cutting timber from nearby groves. Gabions, wicker baskets filled with earth, were stacked for cover. Mantlets, large wooden shields on wheels, were dragged forward by oxen. Engineers mapped the moats. Fire arrows and matchlocks were prepared. Blacksmiths built ramps and laid plank roads across soggy ground. It was a siege in motion. A white-clad envoy approached the gates of Fushimi. His message, read aloud, offered safe passage to all who surrendered. "Lay down arms," he shouted, "and be spared. The castle is doomed. Your master is far away." The response was swift. From the main tower, a red banner unfurled, "Duty over life." That same afternoon, the bombardments began. Heavy Teppo teams advanced under mantlet cover, probing the outer palisades. Arrows flew across the moats. The defenders responded with musket volleys from behind murder holes, the smoke clinging to the summer air. Inside the castle, routines snapped into motion. Rotations manned each bailey and wall segment. Drummers signaled shifts. Scouts at the sally ports slipped out at night to mark enemy fire positions and return before dawn. The castle wells ran deep, their buckets cool even in the heat. Kitchens rationed rice by weight. Powder stores were sealed tight, shaded from sparks. The defenders ate in silence, listening to distant hammering. Across the moat, the enemy's camps grew. Rows of tents, palisades of sharpened stakes, cooking fires that filled the valley with greasy smoke. Horses whinnied in the night. Occasionally, a conch shell call echoed over the water, signaling movements in the dark. Torii Mototada stood on the inner wall, watching the fires. "These men come for conquest," he murmured to himself. "But we are already home." A guard nearby shifted uneasily. "Should we send another message to Kyoto, my lord?" Torii nodded. A courier would slip through the side gate before dawn, bearing word to Tokugawa's local allies. Reinforcements would never arrive, but morale demanded the hope. For now, the defenders would hold. And bleed time from the enemy, 1 hour at a time. The castle breathed like a living thing. Torii Mototada's garrison worked in rhythm, measured, relentless, precise. Palisades reinforced with logs and iron nails stood behind steep ditches. New earthworks rose near the west gate, shaped by hand and shovel. A shigeru layered gabions atop the stone walls, forming bulwarks against gunfire and fire arrows. In the central courtyard, powder barrels were wrapped in waxed cloth and stored in sunken stone rooms. Rain was rare, but the summer heat pressed down like a smith's hammer. Match cords, braided to ignite teppo, were kept damp, hung from shaded beams and checked hourly. No sound was wasted. Drums marked the changing of watch shifts. Bells signaled when enemy scouts were sighted beyond the ridge. Inside the barracks, men sharpened yari, spears, by firelight. Some muttered prayers. Others polished helmets or fixed saddles that would never be ridden again. Civilians had long since gone. Only the warrior households remained. Behind the keep, an old shrine stood with its doors open. The castle priest knelt each dawn to light incense. Torii visited it once a day, quietly placing a folded paper charm for his son. On the third day, a great sound rolled across the plain. The enemy had begun their siege drums, low, throbbing rhythms that shook the soil. Tents now ringed the southern approach. A dozen commanders took positions at key hills and groves. Night scouts counted over 100 mantlets and several movable towers in progress. Signals flashed from the upper watchtower. The Western Army was extending trenches from the southwest. Sappers and laborers were seen carrying gabions and wide shields. They moved slowly, protected by matchlock cover. The defenders began counter-trenching, digging narrow side pits and placing sharpened stakes soaked in oil. Barrels of lime and sand were brought to the outer walls, ready to blind or ignite. Every measure mattered. In the tower chamber, Torii met with his senior captains, Inaba Mitsunari, Nakamura Takahisa, and Old Watanabe, the gate sergeant. "We must hold them until they bleed leadership," Torii said. "Delay is victory." Takahisa frowned. "They are not reckless." Mitsunari's men build as if for months. Torii looked out toward the glowing camps. "They believe time is theirs. Let us correct them." On the second night, clouds rolled low over the plain. Sparks from enemy campfires floated upward like embers from a kiln. The smell of cooked millet drifted on the wind. Suddenly, from the north gate sally port, 10 riders burst forth, shouting, firing, throwing torches. They reached an enemy stockade under construction and set it alight before retreating under a hail of arrows. Back in the castle, defenders cheered, but quietly. Noise could cost lives. Torii gave a single nod. "The wind is with us. For now." Smoke rose before dawn. The Western Army's sappers had spent the night assembling mantlets near the moat edge, shielded by fog and silence. Just before sunrise, they advanced, lines of men pushing tall wooden screens on creaking wheels. Behind them came matchlock gunners, and farther back, teams with fire arrows bundled in tar-soaked rags. The defenders had expected this. At Torii's order, the moat bridges had been destroyed. Planks and stones were dumped to deepen the waterline. Archers and teppo squads were rotated to the walls before first light. When the enemy mantlets reached range, drums sounded once from the inner keep. 3 sharp cracks rang out. From behind arrow slits and rooftop positions, Fushimi's gunners fired in unison. Smoke billowed. Bullets struck the mantlets, punching through weaker boards. Shouts and screams echoed across the water. The first mantlet listed, then toppled into the moat. But the sappers kept coming. From the rear lines, fire arrows launched into the sky. Arcing over the moat, they fell upon the castle's tiled roofs and wooden eaves. Sparks scattered across dry shingles. Smoke began curling from the southern barracks. Bucket chains formed instantly. Defenders dashed through tight corridors, hauling water from the wells. Roof tiles were kicked free to release pressure. A shigeru beat at flames with soaked cloaks. In the chaos, enemy marksmen advanced to the far bank. Their matchlocks flashed orange, hammering the parapets with fire. Bullets chipped stone and splintered beams. One defender fell from the wall, silent. But the sally ports opened again. From the east gate, a team of riders galloped out, each carrying fire pots and oil jars. They flanked the enemy sappers and hurled burning oil across the trenches. Gabions caught fire. A tower in progress collapsed, its frame ablaze. The raiders wheeled back and disappeared into the trees, circled the ridge, and re-entered through the north gate. 2 horses returned without riders. Inside the keep, commanders met briefly. "They're testing our rhythm," said Inaba Mitsunari. "Probing weak points." Torii nodded. "Then we give them none." He ordered a change in guard rotations, less predictable timing, irregular drumming, dummy patrols along the upper walkways. Fake banners were raised on empty towers to confuse scouts. Powder was moved nightly between hidden caches. That evening, the air stank of burnt pine and soaked rope. Smoke hung low over the moat reeds, thick as fog. Cicadas had gone silent again. Only the groan of shifting mantlets and the distant sound of saws marked the enemy's work. One soldier stood watch alone on the west wall. He looked toward the orange glow of the camps and whispered to himself. "They burn wood. We burn ours." Thunder rolled across the plain. On the 7th night of the siege, a summer storm broke over Fushimi. Rain came first in fat drops, then in sheets, hammering the stone walls and flooding trenches. The castle's defenders prayed the downpour would quench the fire, but it brought new dangers. The enemy had used the storm as cover. Beneath black clouds, the Western Army's engineers moved siege towers into place. Taller than the walls, they bristled with platforms for matchlock gunners and shields for archers. Farther back, battering rams were rolled forward, each wrapped in soaked hides to resist fire. Torii's watchers saw movement too late. By the time bells rang out, 2 siege towers were nearly at the outer bailey. "Ready the fire pots," shouted Watanabe, the gate sergeant. But rain hissed against flames. Fire arrows sputtered and fell short. Only one tower was slowed. The second reached the wall. From its upper level, enemy gunners fired downward. Bullets ripped through the battlements. Defenders fell back to secondary positions, dragging wounded through mud. Meanwhile, at the western gate, rams pounded the oaken doors. The defenders had reinforced them with sandbags and bracing beams, but each strike shook the frame. Torii ordered archers to the flanks. From hidden slits, they fired sideways into the ramming teams, striking legs and shoulders. Gunners followed, unleashing volleys when the ram crews bunched to push. Still, the ram inched forward. In the inner ward, every bag of powder and rice was now counted hourly. Ammunition was stacked in sealed baskets. Ration sizes were halved. Rain fouled many match cords, blacksmiths worked under awnings to dry and retwist them. The inner bailey well remained clear, but 2 outer ones had turned to mud. A scout limped into the command chamber that evening. "They've begun tunneling," he reported. "We heard digging under the north wall. Mines." Enemy sappers had begun carving tunnels beneath the outer walls to place charges. It was a tactic from the continent, brutal and effective. The defenders responded by filling wine jars with water and setting them along stone corridors. If the jars rippled, the diggers were close. Torii addressed his officers by lantern light. "When the mines go, we fall back, one bailey at a time. No disorder." Inaba frowned. "We could lose a full ring in a single blow. Then we make them fight for every stone." Outside, lightning flashed over the hills, briefly illuminating the tangled maze of siegeworks. Smoke from wet powder drifted slowly, clinging to the mud. Torii took a sip from a clay cup, water cold and clean. "We're not here to survive," he said quietly, "but to subtract their future." That night, the west gate groaned with each strike. But it held. The walls cracked before dawn. A deep rumble shook the stones, followed by a blast of wind and smoke. Dust rose like a wave over the northern corner of the outer bailey. One of the enemy mines had been fired. The defenders had tried to counter-dig, but the charge struck first. A section of wall collapsed, dragging men and timber into the moat. "Fall back to the second line," came the cry. Torii's officers had prepared for this. Each bailey was rigged with pre-marked retreat paths and sealed supply drops. As the enemy surged through the breach, defenders pulled back to the second ring, lighting fuses to destroy gabions and wagons behind them. The explosion had signaled a shift in pace. No longer probing, the Western Army pushed hard. Siege towers were now anchored against the walls. From their tops, gunners raked the castle with relentless fire. Archers followed, shooting down at angles that pierced helmet gaps and neck guards. At the western gate, the ram finally broke through. Enemy troops poured into the breach, but met a fresh line of yari in narrow alleys. Spears thrust in tight formation, guided by drums from the keep. Volley fire became a rhythm, 3 rows, fire, reload, fire again. Torii Mototada stood at the second ring, his armor black with ash, his voice hoarse. "Hold this ground. If they take it, they take Kyoto." Inaba Mitsunari led the left wall defense, directing fire with red and white flags. On the right, Watanabe and a few survivors from the gate team pushed back repeated charges with oil-soaked logs and quick volleys. But numbers took their toll. By the evening of the 10th day, the outer bailey was lost. Fires burned in the lower courtyards. The dead were dragged back and stacked in corners, covered with rice sacks. A shrine was struck by artillery, its paper charms scattered across the muddy stones. Torii watched from the inner ward, now the last stronghold. His men were weary. Hands trembled as they reloaded matchlocks. Eyes stared too long into the smoke. Inside the keep, rice rations were cut again. 1 handful per man, boiled once. The defenders gathered for a final council beneath the main tower. Rainwater leaked through the roof. "We can hold another day," said Takahisa, "but not much more." Torii looked at the floor. "Then 1 more day is what we give." He ordered the drum team to move into the inner ward. The signal tower was fortified with stone and sand, guarded by the last archers. From here, all remaining fire would be coordinated. As the sun set, fire arrows lit the horizon once more. But the castle still stood. Blackened, broken, but unfallen. The Western Army paused to count their dead. Inside, Torii knelt alone in the main hall and wrote his final letter to Ieyasu. It would never be sent. The smell of ash clung to every wall. Inside Fushimi Castle's inner ward, the air was thick with powder smoke, sweat, and burnt wood. The wells had fouled, choked by debris and soot. Buckets returned half mud, half cinders. Fire from the siege towers had rained down for 2 days without pause. Roofs smoldered. Courtyards glowed orange beneath the shattered moonlight. Yet the keep still stood. The Western army, impatient and bloodied, had shifted tactics. Instead of storming outright, they now pressed from all sides, launching constant small attacks meant to wear down the last defenders. No hour passed without a skirmish. Gunners kept their match cords lit at all times, even in sleep. Yari squads stood ready behind barricades of broken timbers. Each drumbeat from the signal tower echoed command: fire, rotate, fall back. The rhythms grew shorter. Inside the keep's second level, Torii Mototada gathered his officers once more. The room was dim, the floor scraped and blackened. Helmets and cuirasses hung along the walls, each marked by soot and blood. "We hold no hope of rescue," he said. "But we can give them something else." He unrolled a rough map of the castle's outskirts. "Their siege works, storehouses, mantlets, powder carts, are vulnerable. Tonight, we strike them. One last sortie." Gasps stirred the silence. Inaba Mitsunari leaned forward. "We may not return." Torii looked him in the eyes. "That is not our purpose." The plan was simple. Under cover of nightfall, a detachment would exit the rear sally port, loop around the enemy's left flank, and ignite the siege materials, their fuel, powder, and gabion stacks. The damage would be minor, but it would cost the enemy time, confusion, and composure. At dusk, storm clouds gathered again, as if summoned by the castle's own grief. In the half-light, Torii bowed before the shrine behind the keep. He placed one final paper charm on the altar. "To slow them," he whispered. Then he took his place at the head of the sortie column. They moved fast and silent, slipping through the narrow postern. Rain began to fall, light, but enough to muffle footsteps. By the time enemy scouts noticed, the first wagons were aflame. Powder barrels cracked with sudden bursts. Flames leapt across the dry trenches. From the hills, conch shells blared. The Western army scrambled to contain the fires, to resecure their lines. Several mantlets collapsed in the blaze. A siege tower near the southern moat caught alight, collapsing in a groan of burning beams. Inside the castle, watchers on the walls saw the smoke and did not cheer. They simply nodded. The sortie team returned, bloodied, half their number gone. Torii entered last, armor scorched, his right sleeve torn. "They'll need another day," he said quietly. At midnight, a final envoy arrived. The Western commanders offered terms of surrender, life for the garrison, honors for Torii. He declined. "I was not sent to survive," he replied. "I was sent to delay you." By morning, the siege resumed. But the siege work smoldered, and the sky still held smoke. Time, once more, had been stolen. The drums fell silent. Smoke no longer drifted, it clung. The last day dawned gray, windless. From the battered parapets of Fushimi Castle's inner keep, defenders could see the enemy reorganizing. No more cautious advances. The Western army had prepared for a final push. They had lost men, siege towers, and valuable time. But the walls were near collapse. The moat was now bridged with rubble and broken mantlets. The keep's upper floors sagged beneath blackened beams. And the wells, once clean and deep, had turned to sludge and cinder. Inside, the last 100 defenders stood ready. Their matchlocks were down to the final charges. Spears were notched and chipped. Some wore armor stripped from the fallen. Many had not slept in 2 days. Torii Mototada walked the corridors of the keep, greeting each squad by name. His voice was rough but steady. Where hands trembled, his presence steadied them. Where eyes wavered, his glance anchored them. "This is the end of our purpose," he said, not shouting, but clearly enough to carry down the stairs. Our lives have served the hour. Enemy horns cried out from the plain. The assault began. From three sides, Western troops surged forward. Scaling ladders rose against the charred stone. Matchlock gunners fired from trenches, keeping the defenders pinned as assault teams rushed forward with axes and torches. At the second floor, defenders rotated positions every 10 minutes to maintain volleys. Each group fired, reloaded, ducked smoke. The drum team, down to 2 men, beat the rhythm with scorched hands. A breach was forced in the western wall. Rubble poured inward. Defenders countercharged with spears and swords, slowing the incursion with grit and blood. They retreated, step by step, to the upper hall. By noon, the keep's interior was engulfed in flame and choking ash. Fabric burned. Beams cracked. A final contingent fell back to the main tower, the symbolic heart of Fushimi. Outside, Western banners were raised along the lower walls. Their soldiers moved cautiously now, aware of the desperation of cornered men. Torii Mototada ascended the final stair. He wore formal armor, black lacquer, the Tokugawa crest still shining on his chest. The room was bare. Only his sword and a small, folded letter remained on the floor. He looked out across the plain. The fires from the sortie still smoldered on the far slope. Enemy commanders regrouped below. Some called for surrender one last time. Torii did not respond. Below, a handful of his men attempted to escape, slipping into narrow alleys or over broken rooftops. A few would survive, hiding, fleeing, disappearing into forests near Uji. But the defense was finished. As the Western troops surged up the inner stairs, the defenders made no final charge. They stood firm, tired, broken, unbent. The battle ended not with noise, but with smoke and silence. Fushimi Castle had fallen. But not swiftly. Not cheaply. Not before 13 days of fire, grit, and unshakable resolve. That delay would echo in every hour that followed. Smoke still lingered over the burned stones of Fushimi Castle when Tokugawa Ieyasu received word. Torii Mototada was dead. The castle had fallen. But it had held for 13 days. And those 13 days, won by fire, flesh, and discipline, shifted the course of the war. While the Western army paused to regroup, secure the ruined castle, and garrison its shell, Ieyasu advanced. He crossed the Kiso River, secured the Nakasendo route, and rallied wavering lords. At every crossroad, time bought at Fushimi became leverage. Every day delayed cost Ishida Mitsunari the loyalty of one more undecided clan. By early autumn, Sekigahara, a narrow plain flanked by hills and mist, became the site of decision. The Tokugawa vanguard, strengthened by arrivals from Shinano and Kai, met Mitsunari's coalition in the valley. Rain fell, and winds shifted. Betrayals cracked the western lines. Commanders defected mid-battle. Others, hesitant, arrived late. All of it, the hesitation, the fracture, stemmed in part from delays. Torii's stand had fractured the enemy's momentum. Plans made in June collapsed in October. At Sekigahara, Tokugawa won. From that battle rose 2.5 centuries of Tokugawa rule. The shogunate moved to Edo. The age of open war was over, replaced by enforced peace and controlled silence. Torii Mototada was buried with honors. His death was mourned by few but respected by all. His family name was preserved, his children protected by Ieyasu's word. A shrine rose near the ruins of Fushimi. Farmers passing on the Uji road would stop to bow, placing a stone at its base. In later years, samurai children would study his final letters, not for poetry, but for the steel within them. To die without regret, knowing the purpose is fulfilled, that is the path, he had written. The siege of Fushimi was no grand clash. It was not glorious. It was not clean. But it was exact. Measured. A sacrifice of precision. Time became a weapon. And in the calculus of war, that was enough to shape a nation. Thank you for walking the walls with us. To honor more stories like this, subscribe and stay with the channel.